Senate Democrats suffered a major setback Wednesday night after voting rights legislation failed to advance in the chamber. Skyler Henry has more on what's next in the fight to pass voting reforms.
President Biden says he'll continue to push for voting rights, even though the legislation failed in the Senate Wednesday night. He said, "I'm profoundly disappointed that the United States Senate has failed to stand up for our democracy. I'm disappointed, but I'm not deterred."
The yeas are 52, the nays are 48.
The bill failed after Democratic Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin refused to sign off on changes to the filibuster rule, which requires 60 votes for legislation to proceed.
The United States Senate has never in 233 years been able to end debate on legislation with a simple majority vote.
Frustration over their actions has prompted some progressives to call for Democrats to target the senators in primary elections, but Senate leadership shot down that suggestion.
I think that's very short-sighted, and I don't want to engage in that conversation. I'm disappointed in the positions they took, but it was entirely within their right to do it. In a 50-50 Senate, we value every member.
Democrats now have to regroup and figure out another way to protect the voting rights of all Americans who are eligible to vote.
Our goal was to remove obstacles of participation. Instead of what the Republicans are doing is to put up obstacles of participation. So the fight for voting rights continues. We will not relent. The fight goes on.
But Republicans remain steadfastly opposed to federal changes to election laws.
This is not a problem. Turnout is up, biggest turnout since 1900. It's simply they're being sold a bill of goods.
Democrats may now try to break up the voting rights legislation into separate bills and pass it piece by piece. Skyler Henry, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
For more on this, I'm joined by Matt Keelen and Antjuan Seawright. Matt is a principal at the International Government Affairs and Consulting firm, the Vogel Group. Antjuan is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Antjuan, we're in the middle of an election year that will likely decide which party takes control of Congress. How might the midterm elections be affected if federal voting rights legislation is not passed?
Oh, I think it's going to have a tremendous effect simply because the largest vote share of African Americans that showed up in the history of this country showed up in the 2020 election for President Joe Biden. The efforts to suppress and suffocate those votes came at an elevated fashion in ways we have not seen in a very long time to limit those votes at the ballot box. If you look at what happened in Georgia, where it's now illegal to give someone a bottle of water in line, if you look at the rearranging and the closing of drop box locations in Texas, and even laws in certain states like Georgia, going back to Georgia, where I think the heart and soul of this fight is, where literally a Republican-led legislature can overturn an election. All that has led to the big lie, as we know, led to the insurrection at the Capitol. And so if those votes are limited at the ballot box or suffocated, it could have impact. However, I'm African American. I'm from the South. We've been through these times before. We've been through these situations before. So for all those who have interest in suffocating and silence our votes, I remind people, we've put our lives on the line before to show up to vote to help save this country. And I don't think in 2022 it will be any different. It may be tougher and it may be a little harder and the battle may be different, but I don't think the result in the end will be different.
Matt, not one Republican senator voted in favor of this voting rights bill on Wednesday. What are the reasons they're opposed to this legislation?
They believe that states have the rights to set their own election laws. Quite frankly, when President Biden showed up in Georgia, Antjuan, I'd love to know why Stacey Abrams didn't come to support him in that speech. But the other thing I'd also like to know is, why didn't he go to Delaware? Why didn't he go to New York, where it's actually harder to vote in those two states than it is currently in Georgia after this new law is passed?
Antjuan, I'll let you go ahead and respond to Matt's question and also tell us more about where Democrats intend to go from here.
Well, Matt, with all due respect, the reason Stacey Abrams did not show up to the speech is because she had another obligation that was way ahead of time, locked in to her schedule. She's running for the office of governor in Georgia. What the president came to do to talk about an issue that she has been advocating and working on for a very long time. And the crowd that showed up to hear the president in Georgia is a crowd that's already going to give full participation to Stacey Abrams in the next election. She's doing the work and she's carrying the load for what she needs to do, and everyone totally respects that. Where do we go from here? I think in the same way you heard the president talk about elements of Build Back Better, perhaps passing out of one body to the next, I think you may see some similar posture, and you're already starting to see that bubble up in the Senate to where some elements of voting rights will pass the Senate and get back to the House, and we will get something to push back on these legislative proposals all around the country. I think there were over 448 states all around the country.
So, Matt, I want to follow up also on the point that you were making about New York and Delaware and your argument that it's harder to vote in those places. I understand the idea of federalism and having states' rights, but throughout our history, there have been times when it was necessary for us to ensure that all American citizens are given an equal opportunity to vote. Is there a scenario in which some GOP members might, in fact, get on board, shifting their positions? And if so, what would it take to get Republicans and Democrats in Congress to agree on some measure of voting rights legislation?
I think Leader McConnell said it best in your earlier clip. The Democrats are in search of a problem and try to have a federal solution, one that isn't there. In 2020, we had record turnout. We also had, obviously, the COVID pandemic. Hopefully, I know Joe Biden has promised to crush the COVID pandemic. Hasn't happened yet in his presidency. I hope and pray that it does happen in 2022, and that by the time we have elections, we have normal elections, not like we had in 2020, where we had, obviously COVID restrictions and COVID pandemic concerns. But the other thing, and with all due respect to Antjuan, we've both worked on races at the highest level. You do not show up for the president of your party in your state when he comes there to talk about an issue that you care about, unless you don't think it's going to pass. And quite frankly, Joe Biden's problems right now, Republicans have opposed him, but he can't get Democrats to unify behind him because he's at a 33% approval rating.
So, Antjuan,
and that's because his agenda is not getting things done that he had promised, which was to govern from the center and to unite this country. He is doing more to divide us in this first year, and I hope he pivots for the good of the country to trying to unite us in 2022.
So, Antjuan, I know you have a lot of things that you want to say in response to Matt's points there. I just want to add that obviously, as we're talking about Thursday marking 1 year since President Biden was sworn into office, there are questions about his performance, at least when we're looking at these new public approval ratings. How do you rate his performance, and what do you think should be his focus in his second year?
Well, Lana, I'll say this. Let me remind my dear friend Matt that every time we have increased African-American turnout in this country, there seems to be an elevated effort to suppress those votes after the fact. We saw that after the 2008 election, and now we see it after the 2020 election. When it comes to voting rights, it's always been a bipartisan issue. That's why most occasions where we've had to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, it's been done under a Republican president in which you had bipartisan support from Republican senators. I think there may be 10 of them still serve, at least 10 still serving in the U.S. Senate, who voted on more than one occasion to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. But fast forward the tape to the president's first year in office. When Joe Biden took office, Lana, remember, there were 18 million people receiving unemployment benefits. That's down to 3.9%, the largest one-year drop in this country's history. Only 1% of the population were vaccinated. Now 75% of adults in this country are fully vaccinated. 6.4 million jobs. 5 million people have access to health insurance. 96% of the schools in this country are still open. We have a bipartisan infrastructure bill, Matt. That word bipartisan means Republicans and Democrats delivered, which came from the desk of Joe Biden, and not to mention the American Rescue Act. I call it the American Survival Act. That literally was the safety pin to hold this country together in the worst pandemic in my lifetime.
Matt Keelen.
Well, Antjuan, I truly appreciate your spin on what has been a historically terrible year for a first-term president. Just before we came on, we were talking about problems in Ukraine, problems in China. China wants to make aggressive moves toward Taiwan. Ukraine, the Russians are on the border. There's a possible invasion. Even Joe Biden said, well, maybe he's going to take over Ukraine. He's going to invade Ukraine. We have problems across the board. And again, this president promised us to crush the virus. He promised us to crush the virus by July 1st. It is now almost February. He has not crushed the virus. He missed on the tests. He missed on masks. He's missing on the economy. Inflation is absolutely, Antjuan, through the roof. Regular people are sitting around their kitchen table trying to figure out, hey, can we go on vacation this year? Probably not. Can we afford to have hamburger this week for dinner on Sunday? Probably not, because it's 100% more expensive than it was a year ago. The president needs to pivot back to the middle. He ran as a centrist. He ran to unite the country. I hope and pray that he does that. I would do that by bringing Republicans in. And Antjuan made a great point on the infrastructure bill. Republicans will vote with this president when he sits down with them and negotiates. But if he's not going to negotiate with them, they're not going to negotiate with him. And by the way, he's also going to bring in Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, and they're in his own party. So this poor guy can't even get his whole party to back him. Stacey Abrams doesn't come to hear him speak on an issue that he cares about because his approval rating is at 33%.
All right, Matt Keelen, Antjuan Seawright, thank you both.